Hello. Sorry about that. Already messed that up. My name is Chris Vials, and I'm going to be moderating this panel. And the panel is entitled "The Language of the Good: Fighting Fascism in Culture." And we have three distinguished panelists here, and I'm going to just be very brief in introducing all of us. So my name is Chris Vials. I am a professor of professor of English and American Studies at the University of Connecticut. Also, to my immediate left, Philip Eliasoph, who's professor of art history and visual culture at Fairfield University, author of much, but also he wanted to emphasize that there's an Arthur Szyk exhibit at Fairfield University that's open till December 16th, which looks fabulous. In the middle, we have Samantha Baskind, who is a distinguished professor of art history at Cleveland State University and is also the author of 5 books, most recently, The Warsaw Ghetto and American Art and Culture. Last but certainly not least, we have Thomas Doherty, who is professor of American Studies at Brandeis University, a major scholar in film studies, and most recently, he is also the author of, Hollywood, or not most recently, but he's author of Hollywood and Hitler, 1933 to 1939. Now, I was just going to say a few comments to kind of frame the panel here, which is on, first of all the three of our panelists are about to show you images from comic books, graphic illustrations, from magazines, and clips of narrative film. But in such cultural artifacts might seem trivial when thinking about a fight against fascism, especially when that fight, historically, has involved legislative campaigns, legal actions like the SPLC has been waging, and of course more visceral fights like anti-fascist street fighting, physical resistance to coup d'etats, not to mention epic hot war against fascism known as World War II. But the importance of culture, be it a DC comic or a prize-winning novel, is that it helps to activate the ideas, beliefs, and values of these more visceral battles and campaigns, and to enlist people in them in the first place. In the 1930s, from inside one of Mussolini's jails, Italian leftist political philosopher Antonio Gramsci wrote that politics are incubated in the terrain of culture. That is to say, for an idea to even get to the realm of formal mainstream politics, much less to animate a physical battle, that it has to begin in the everyday world of words and images where values and beliefs are circulated and forged. Now, this was well known to artists, writers, and filmmakers in the 1930s and 40s who created anti-fascist work. Whereas Germany, Italy, and Japan moved to the right in the Depression years, the United States in many ways moved to the left, and a vast fundamentally anti-fascist movement pushed for a more equitable economy at home and a more aggressive foreign policy against fascist aggression abroad. They pushed FDR and Congress to adopt foundational economic reforms in the period and helped to create a legal infrastructure for workers' rights and a social safety net in this country that remains to this day bruised but still breathing. As our panelists will illustrate, Jewish Americans were critical to the movement of the 1930s and 40s, especially its cultural wing, where they were overrepresented. Jews intimately knew the stakes of the fight against fascism as it was aimed at their very existence. So their work enlisted those both inside and outside the Jewish community in the fight against fascism, and it's important to remember in this context that before the United States entered World War II in December 1941, fascism was not universally understood to be a dirty word in the United States. Its value was still in the realm of debate, and it had to be made into a dirty word in the realm of culture. Jewish American cultural and political work before and during the war helped to make it so. So I have kind of 3 questions, or a set of questions for y'all, but to spend probably the most time in the first, I want you to, just each of you, you've brought in various artifacts, right, various cultural artifacts. And if you could just walk us through the artifacts you're going to be kind of discussing, and also a little bit about the artists and authors, and basically how they represented fascism to American audiences, and how their medium shaped their message. So.
Thank you, Chris. Let me take a moment to acknowledge the outstanding relevancy of today's panel. I know it's been said before this morning, but I remember Gav Rosenfeld talking to us about this almost a year ago as this was being developed, and it is, as Yogi Berra once said, it's all deja vu all over again, and in a way, sadly and almost tragically, that we are talking about these issues of danger, anti-Semitism, threats to the Jewish people. So I want to acknowledge that clearly. I've had the privilege of working on an extraordinary artist, and though the theme is America, in the case of author Szyk, who was born in Łódź, Poland, let's put up the first image of author Szyk. And Szyk is, of course, in generations of American Jews know his great Haggadah, his great work, grew up with various editions of the Szyk Haggadah, but he was an immigrant who had arrived in the port of New York City. He arrived in the fall, November of 1940. And so what we have with Szyk is a unique character who straddles. He was totally aware of the threat of what Nazism was. He was completely aware of the mortal danger of it as a Pole who was living in London in the 30s. He comes with the help of the British and Canadian embassy. He arrives in Halifax, and then he comes to New York City. Reportedly, this is anecdotal, the newspaper in Halifax reported he arrived in 1940, and the press was talking about he had a price on his head. He was already a dangerous man as a political cartoonist and illustrator. When we look at Szyk in his life journey, he is, think of somebody who is coming from the Eastern Ashkenazi Pale of settlement, or he's from Poland. He's a kind of Roman Vishniak meets Norman Rockwell. And he's an extraordinary bridge between understanding the threat of Nazism, understanding fascism, understanding living in London in the late 30s, seeing what Kristallnacht and what was happening, and at the same time, he made his way to America to become this extraordinary propagandist. He was known best as the soldier in art, okay? And this is an extraordinary drawing on the upper left. The great scholar and the person, we would not really be speaking about author Szyk in this context, or our exhibit, which is on loan from the Magnus Jewish Library up at Berkeley, were it not for our great friend Irv Ungar, who really has devoted his life, and Irv is here, I want to acknowledge him, and with all my heartfelt appreciation for, Irv has spent, thank you Irv, Irv has spent the last 35 years of his life completely resurrecting the career of this extraordinary artist. This drawing is dated 1933, and it's so it threads so beautifully back to the way Hitler is being portrayed here as Pharaoh. And in doing so, the whole 3,000-year history of the Jewish narrative of the fight against tyranny, the fight against dictators, in one drawing, we already begin to see Szyk at his powers, and this is 1933. So we understand that what he will do is showing us the threat to America. In 1940, this illustration appeared in the American Mercury magazine, and I wanted to give a shout out to my friend Gav Rosenfeld, my colleague from Fairfield University, and this idea that the Statue of Liberty is being transformed into this grotesque image of the face of Hitler. And if you look very carefully at the lower left, you see a figure of Charles Lindbergh, America First, leader, decorated, and on the right, playing with a toy airplane, is Hermann Goering, and we all know how Lindbergh, Lindy, the great American, this irresistibly iconic, handsome, swashbuckling fellow, he so dominated the America First movement at that time. So I use this as a kind of, This is the prelude, I'll say, everybody. This is the prelude, and we'll move on, okay?
Thank you, and I wanted to just thank the Milbergs, Ellen and Leonard, for their sponsorship today and for their friendship as well. I'm interested, oh good, they're up. I am interested in comic books and caricature as well, like Schick's work, and cartoonists and how these different figures combat fascism. So we're starting with Superman because he's Superman. And Superman was the first comic superhero. He was conceived he first came to light in Action Comics, 1938, and he was conceived by two Jewish teenagers from Cleveland, Ohio. So Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster. I think it's important. They're Jewish, and it's important that the comic book industry was built by the Jews from the ground up. So even the founders of early comics, Charles Gaines, he kind of invented the comic book. There were funnies in the newspaper, but then there were, he came up with the idea, let's staple them together, make them into books and sell them. So Superman, the dates on all these covers, and I'm showing you covers on purpose because covers are really how fascism was first explored. These stories didn't make it into the comic books until quite a bit later. So here we have a 1941 Superman cover, and on the other side we have 42. Look at 42, it's a little bit more aggressive. So here we have Superman. He's got, holding Hitler and Toho up, like Superman somehow can make this better. Superman can conquer fascism. And remember, comic books are fantasies. And these are just fantasies. What's interesting is if Siegel and Shuster invent the first superhero, what happens from there? Well, Superman's so popular that there's lots more superheroes that start popping up. You advance? Great. And I think these two images are particularly important for the fight against fascism. The image on the left is World's Finest Comics. It's Superman as well as Batman and Robin. And look at the cover. This is patriotic. This is, Batman and Robin were invented by Bob Kane and Bill Finger, both Jewish. Robert Kahn was his birth name. And here we have them, the true heroes, the message here on this cover, the true heroes are the American soldiers who go out and fight. We have the heavily muscled arm, and we have, that's embracing these important Americans who are going out to fight. So that's one kind of message that we have on these covers. Again, the stories inside are really they're not about Hitler, they're not about fascism, but these covers are so bright. So this is about the medium. It's Technicolor. The covers are so bright, they're on the newsstand, and people see them. They may not buy them, but they see these sort of soundbite messages right in their face. You can't miss these. Now, also, they were really popular, and people bought them a lot, too. And importantly, in the military abroad, they all traded these. The mail that went abroad the most in the mid-40s were comic books, and the GIs traded them, and they talked about them. And then this sensation comics. I mean, it's hard. There weren't a lot of female superheroes back then, but Wonder Woman was a superhero invented by a man not Jewish. So this is the first not Jewish comic book maker. His name's Charles Moulton. He was actually a psychologist brought in to talk about what comics are doing. And he had his own, you can look him up. But in Sensation Comics, here we have Wonder Woman, and look at her in her patriotic outfit, and she's protecting the Capitol. And I love that it's a woman and that she's empowered. The Charles Moulton, he was asked to write a comic. He didn't know what to do. He said to his wife, "What should I do?" And she said, "As long as it's a woman, do whatever you want." And so here we have Wonder Woman. She had just been in an earlier comic. This is the first time she's on a cover, and she's protecting America in her quintessential American outfit. And this derives from Captain America, who we will look at in a moment.
Great. Thanks for the kind introduction, Chris, and thanks to the Center for the invitation to participate in this wonderful symposium. I'm really honored, and especially this week. I do Hollywood, And I thought I might show a clip really quickly because when I teach undergraduate students, you always like to tantalize them with a clip before you give the lecture. I probably won't have to set it up for this audience as much as I do for my undergraduates because judging by the hair color or lack of hair in the audience, some of you are probably familiar with Spencer Tracy and Mickey Rooney. In the panel earlier today, Steve Ross referred to Hollywood as the world's most effective propaganda machine. Now we call it propaganda if we don't like it. If we like it, we say it promulgates positive cultural values. And I think Hollywood did promulgate a lot of positive cultural values between 1933 and 1945. Now in terms of the relationship between Hollywood and Nazism and anti-Semitism, I think there are three distinct timelines that we might keep in mind. 1933 to 1939 marks one chapter, right? And that of, and then 39, when war erupts in Europe, and 41, when America enters the war, marks another distinct chapter because Hollywood, for the first time now, is producing avowedly anti-Nazi movies. From 41 to 45, which is the time frame you guys were involved in Hollywood terms, the films actually, in some ways, to me, become less interesting because they're explicitly anti-Nazi and they can engage with Nazism in an explicit level. But before then, it's almost always allegorical. And in 1939 to 1941, of course, if Hollywood is making an anti-Nazi movie, they're ahead of the curve. America has not yet entered the war. So I want to show you how Hollywood would do it in a typical year and move back a little bit in time to 1938, which I really think in some way is the pivotal year for so much American popular culture and its relationship with Nazism. I always get, 38, of course, is the year where you have the Anschluss that spring, the invasion of Czechoslovakia, after the Munich Pact on September 30th, and then Kristallnacht. And I always get the impression that after the Americas are going through the Great Depression. Who really cares about what the Germans are doing in Europe? We have other problems, but 38 is the year. I always think of, Dad at the breakfast nook, looking over to his wife when he's reading the newspaper at some point in 1938, and he's saying, the Germans are back at it again. Finally, this is the year that it's back on the radar. And Hollywood begins responding allegorically. And this is my absolute favorite allegorical response to Nazism. It's from a 1938 film called Boys Town. Has anybody ever seen it? All right. Directed by Norman Taurog. And this is the moment where Mickey Rooney, who's the tough kid who's going into Father Flanagan's orphanage town, and he doesn't want any part of this reform, is introduced to the ethos of Boys Town.
Hello, Your Honor. Finished your tour?
The bell saved you, didn't it, buddy?
Buddy, you're sitting beside me.
All right, have fun.
We thank thee, O Lord, for these thy gifts which we have received through thy merciful bounty.
Heavenly Father, I thank you for this food.
Gracious
God, may the food that we are about to receive strengthen our bodies. What's the matter? Can't you all learn the same words?
Don't have to. You say the kind of grace you want to say.
At Boys Town, everybody worships as they please. Think the way they want to think.
Sure, some of us don't have to go to chapel.
If you're a Catholic or a Protestant, you can go right on being one.
Well, I'm nothing.
Then you can go right on being nothing, and nobody cares.
Thanks.
This is American persuasive propaganda at its absolute best, isn't it? Where it doesn't really shove it to you in the face the way totalitarian propaganda does, but it does it in a really emotional, very congenial sort of way. Now, every time, I'll say just one more thing, if I might. Every time I see that clip, I want the kid to say Catholic, Protestant, or Jew. We're not quite there yet. But you've got to be a real dumb spectator in 1938 not to realize that this is a ecumenical moment where we're embracing people from all different religions. And it's especially important is that it's an explicitly Roman Catholic environment. Because, of course, besides Father Flanagan, the most famous priest in America in the 1930s is the anti-Semitic radio priest, Father Coughlin. You also have the deep background of the Spanish Inquisition with forced conversion. In Boys Town, everybody gets to worship the way he wants to.
Just getting to that. So thank you for that wonderful introduction. So my first round of questions is for all of y'all, and it's basically about the effectiveness or efficacy of your various artists and your various artifacts. So you could address the question of effectiveness in several ways. One way to think about it is when I ask how was their work effective in getting across an anti-fascist message. One way is to think about it is did the artifact itself, did the comic, did the illustration, did the film actually convey something about fascism that was core to it? There was a transportable lesson about fascism that was useful. Second thing to think about too in efficacy is how widespread did they get their message across? How vast was their audience? How were they positioned within the culture industries to make a difference? So,
Sure. Okay, let's pop up. I think we have let's go to that. No, let's go next. Forward. No, go to here. Let's do that. Effectiveness. Let's imagine a time when nobody has cell phones, nobody has televisions, no one has anything, no one has cable news on a 24-hour cycle. The American public is going to be informed about issues through popular culture, and this is a very important intersection of popular culture and the gravity of global politics. But popular culture becomes then the most effective tool, and as we move from the complete isolationism, Gallup poll, first week of September 1939, 84% of the American public, non-intervention in the European wars. We saw this in Ken Burns' series, America and the Holocaust. America was not going to be lured. The America First movement had the largest membership of any movement in America in the late 30s. We know that, as we said, the Nazi Party was, in 1939, held their Washington Day rally just at Madison Square, a few blocks from here. So the idea of Arthur Szyk using the cover of Collier's magazine. Now here is this immigrant, he arrives in New York, and quickly, within the first few months, the art directors of the major magazines realize his extraordinary communicative powers. This cover on the left, it's called Madness. If you look carefully in the lower right, Szyk signs it September 1941. Very carefully look in the lower right corner. He is shouting to the world that Hitler's ambitions are not just going to be, as the veil has dropped over France, Belgium, England is now under the Blitz. He is saying that be prepared, America, for global domination. He's like Paul Revere shouting out to the boys at Lexington Concord. Madness. And that is extraordinary, this image of how Szyk is projecting. And I'd like to point out some of the differences of Szyk in comparison of the other American great illustrators, cover artists, Norman Rockwell, J.C. Leyendecker. There are important paintings of the war done from the Office of War Information by Thomas Hart Benton, for example. But let's face it, Szyk has his mother and his brother back in Poland, in Łódź. And in a sense, he's the only major communicator to the American audience using a magazine that has a circulation of 3 million people, and then think about once it's passed along the barber shop and the hair salon, millions of people are going to see what the threat is. This was this was painted just before Pearl Harbor, and it was published on January 17, 1942. He had augured and proven the prophecy. Note the other artists who are Gentile artists, Rockwell, Whitmack, Leyendecker, their response to the war is more anecdotal. The GI, the home, the sentimentality. Schick has to go full force in making his point, in making it as powerfully as possible about what fascism is going to be.
Samantha?
All right, I think my slides are right before this set. All right, great. So I think Captain America is a really interesting, this cover is particularly interesting. Probably most of you have seen it in some reproduction somewhere before. So Captain America is specifically invented to fight the Nazis. Superman just did because they were there at that point, but that wasn't his specific focus. Captain America, Steve Rogers, who was this sickly, kind of scrawny guy, he wanted to be a soldier, and he took a super serum so he could be a soldier. This is Captain America also is, created by two Jews, in particular Jack Kirby is the artist who becomes the greatest comic book artist of all time, in not just my opinion. And in this case, Hitler's getting a sock to the jaw. It's got that Marvel feel to it. This is Marvel Comics. It was earlier called Timely. And in this case, so we have a superhero made specifically to fight Nazis, to fight the Red Skull. We have this energetic cover. Inside, there is some fighting with the Red Skull. But over here, this is where things get really aggressive. So this is a new Batman. This is 1943. If you notice, March 1941, America's not even in the war yet. But here, Batman and Robin are the efficacy here, I think. I think what really makes it's not about patriotism anymore, which we saw in the earlier comics with World's Finest. Here it's about fear. And I think the idea is if you instill fear in these younger people, maybe they'll want to go to war. You instill fear in the larger community, maybe they're going to realize how serious this war is. And in this case, the story inside is about fascism. So it's not just a cover to catch your eye. Inside, it's swastika over the White House. And of course, it's a comic book, so it is a little bit campy still, but it's serious stuff. A German infiltrates the White House, and he's going to take it over for Hitler. And eventually, Batman and Robin thwart the plan by essentially crushing the plan with a large swastika. So yes, it's fantastical, but it's scary, and the cover is scary, and it's not a bright Technicolor cover anymore. The comic book landscape is starting to really change, and it's effective. This is most definitely effective. As I said before, these comic books are in the hands of so many young people and so many old people and so many across the ocean and so many at home.
Chris asked the question about efficacy, and I think one of the ways we know that films and their messages were so effective is that everybody argues about them. You always go to the public screen representation to kind of argue about race, class, ideology, or whatever. And maybe the best example of this is the Production Code Administration, which comes in 1934 to systematically regulate Hollywood cinema. And one of the ways that Hollywood is negotiating Nazism is that it has to deal with three constraints throughout the 1930s. One is the Production Code, which actually forbids Hollywood from treating the nation of any country on the planet disrespectfully. So it basically means you can't make any criticism of anybody. The other constraint is the foreign market. The German market is still kind of influential, and Hollywood doesn't want to affect the distribution of films in Nazi Germany. Two of the studios get out immediately in 1933, when the Nazi government says you got to fire your Jews in your distribution branches in Germany. So Warner Brothers and Universal get out, MGM, Paramount, and Fox stay there basically to the bitter end. There's a lot of debate about why. My own sense it wasn't the money, because they're not making that much money, but in the 30s, everybody thinks Hitler's going to get a bullet put in his head at some point, and they want to sort of keep the distribution pipeline and everything in place in case the Germans go back to their senses. And then the third reason is the ethos of classical Hollywood cinema through most of its life, but especially in the 1930s, is that we're an entertainment machine. People don't come to the movies to see geopolitics debated on screen. They come to see Ginger and Fred dance in Art Deco apartments, and who wants to be disturbed with all these frightening headlines in the newspapers. But when Hollywood did address anything controversial, there's a lot of dialogue about it, and everybody knew these images were important. And then one quick anecdote, one of the reasons I love to speak to groups on Hollywood cinema is everybody has their own set of eyes, everybody has an expertise or memory that I do not have. If I were teaching biochemistry or tax law, that might not be true, but all of you know Hollywood very well. So I show that clip from Boys Town. A woman comes up to me, is that a JCC or something, about 10 years ago, elderly woman, very polite, says, "I love that film. It's one of my favorite films." And I say, "Yeah, it's just a marvelous piece of work." And she says, "You know, the first time I saw that film was in Budapest in 1939. And she said, when I saw it in Budapest, they cut out the Jewish kid with the yarmulke." So the fascist Hungarian government knew that was an important message that they did not want their citizens to see. And then she said to me, which is why I tell this anecdote, and I think I can take it to the bank, she said, "The reason I know that there was a Jewish kid in the original print was that a friend of ours did the Hungarian subtitling for the English language prints that were released in Hungary, and he said when the print came in, it had the Jewish kid, but they cut it for the theatrical release." So these films, everybody knew they had a profound effect, which is why you cut things out of the movies. You didn't want the Hungarian audience to see this in 1939, where a Jewish kid is accepted and welcomed at the table in a Roman Catholic environment and is a totally equal member of the community of Boys Town.
Thank you very much. And so also, before I ask the last question, just to be mindful too, if you have questions for our panel, someone will be coming around momentarily to take your questions down, and they'll give them to me. And if you're watching online, you can write your questions in the chat function. Those will be printed out and given to me as well. So the last round of questions here, before we get to Q&A too, involves the kind of the lessons for the present, right? And I think the kind of unfortunate subtext to this conference and a lot of the scholarship and a lot of what we've written is that fascism, it didn't die in 1945, right? That it does have an afterlife, that we use these terms, you know, conservative and liberal all the time, or conservative all the time, knowing that, you know, conservatives now are not going to look exactly like, you know, Alexander Hamilton or Edmund Burke, right? Fascism has begun to have that same kind of afterlife as a descriptor of the present, right? And so I guess when fighting basically, you know, far-right extremism now, or what we term fascism now, what lessons do you find in these cultural productions that's kind of transportable to the present?
Okay, let's take a look at another great work by Arthur Szyk. Let's go to the next one, and the next one, and that's all we got. Okay, all right. I think that in the case of Arthur Szyk, being an art historian, being an art critic, we're talking about really the universality of the visual iconography, and that whether these are events in caricaturism in ancient Rome, or the caricaturism of Hieronymus Bosch, to Hogarth lampooning the British aristocracy, to Daumier making mincemeat of the Napoleonic successors, whether it's Thomas Nast, whether it's Arthur Schick to David Levine to R. Crumb to Art Spiegelman, you're going to have devastating images that are going to be in the tradition of the grotesque, and they're going to be offensive, and this is about the nature of fine art. Because the visual rhetoric of art, whether it's past, present, the contemporary issues of whether the images of, I think about after 9/11, when there was this spate of Islamophobia, for example, and there were the images of the enemy, of the Islamic enemy. I feel very strongly that as Jews, as the Israelis, American Jews, will understand that the dehumanization of the enemy is something that is going to be understood, and yet, on the other hand, whether you're asking 15 million American boys from farms in Kansas and Minnesota to go to the beaches of Normandy or to the jungles of Iwo Jima, you're going to have to create something that is going to make the enemy look very, very wicked and evil. And there's, to be perfectly frank, you cannot woke, you cannot PC when you're at war. And we are talking about a time when there was an enemy, and as Churchill and Roosevelt understood, it was total victory. It wasn't going to be that we're going to treat whether our German or our Italian or our Japanese enemy with a kind of great humanity and respect. This was the enemy, and they needed to be eliminated. And so this equivocation of, well, sometimes I'm asked by my students, Dr. E., the Jews were stereotyped in the Der Stürmer magazine, and Jews were being caricatured with all kinds of terrible, grotesque faces and images, as we see in the Holocaust museums. How could an artist like Arthur Schick use the same tools? Well, I think that it's quite different when you are the victim and when you're trying to end a genocide which will murder 6 million European Jews. So whether it's past or the enemies of the present, and in this case, our Israeli family and friends are fighting against an evil force, what the President of the United States, President Biden, called sheer evil. So everybody in the audience, let's think about, how do you want to caricaturize sheer evil?
Will you pull up my slides for me?
Yep.
Thanks. Because this is what I want. Perfect. I think that these two images really help show what Phil's talking about. World's Finest Comics on the left. Here we have Batman, Robin, and Superman. It's baseball season, by the way. Here, it's this spring issue. And they're knocking out the Axis with bonds and stamps. Well, for one, comics are being used to get money for war, to raise money for war, for bonds and stamps. But at the same time, if you can see, there's caricature going on here, as well as the image on your right as well. So look at how, Hitler, okay, we can caricature him. We're not caricaturing an entire people. But in general, Japanese people were caricatured in a really standardized, kind of ugly way for the moment now. In fact, there's a comic, so I should mention, I'm looking at comic books, but Dr. Seuss was a major comic artist at this time doing caricatures. Saul Steinberg, Al Hirschfeld, major classic artists. Dr. Seuss was not Jewish, the other two were. But then if you look at the image on your right, here we have, more bonds and stamps and more caricatures of the faces. There's a pretty harsh drawing by Dr. Seuss. He made lots of images for PM, as did the other artists that I was mentioning, as did Arthur Schick, in which one French figure says to a doctor, okay, I'm going into the Japanese army. I need slanty eyes now, like he can get them added. It's terrible. I've got comic book covers, which are to fight against the Japan Nazis. And those are the covers of Superman and Batman, like these characters that are supposed to be wholesome and American, but every bit of the arsenal was pulled out, at this time in comics. And then one other thing I wanted to say, because when Ruth was talking this morning in the first panel about Trump and propaganda and cultism, what came to my mind, and I always carry books around even when I'm traveling out of state, was one particular comic I want to just tell you about briefly. And hold on. Here we go. So it's Hitler, and he's got a baton, and he's got a baton over a man's head, and he says, "This is an Aryan. He's composed of A, uniform, B, body, C, propaganda, formerly called soul." That's by Saul Steinberg in February of 1943. So the past does inform the present. Go ahead.
Just before Tom speaks, just as a reminder that the person's coming around to collect your questions. So.
Yeah, Chris, your question, I guess when you mentioned that a lot of conservatives today don't look like Alexander Hamilton and Edmund Burke, I feel compelled in the last week especially to point out that a lot of people who call themselves progressives don't look like Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt today. So when you see fascism, wherever you see it, the solution is probably to stand up to it. And I happen to have a clip from the 1938 episode of a very influential screen magazine called The March of Time, which I think some of you might know about. It's best known today as the model for the News on the March sequence from Citizen Kane. And a lot of my students don't get the joke because they weren't watching The March of Time in 1941. And if audiences had come into Citizen Kane 5 minutes late, which they didn't back in the 1940s, they probably wouldn't have known that this was a satire. They would have read it as the March of Time. And in January of 1938, the March of Time got a cameraman into Germany, Nazi Germany, and did the first full-length expose of what life was like behind the scenes of Nazi Germany. Now, of course, it had to be compromised. Goebbels watched the cameraman, but the guy got a couple shots of the benches, and especially the narration was avowedly and explicitly anti-Nazi. It was probably the first time most Americans saw the images on screen that now unspool in our heads incessantly, the images of the marching Nazi Superman, the swastikas, the German leaders, because these things, even when they were shown in the newsreels, might have been cut out by the local exhibitor. And it concerns a confrontation with the German-American Bund, which of course was the fifth column run by the Nazis in America in the 1930s, from Phil's neck of the woods in Connecticut, where the town is having a typical good old American New England town meeting in which they're discussing whether they should let the Nazis buy some property in their county to have a campground. So this is the clip from...
And last call for questions.
Teaching film for 30 years, no matter what the technology, it always, it's a projector, the bulb blows, VHS, the tape gets eaten. Yeah.
In New York City, loudest mouthpiece in this Nazi propaganda drive is the national chairman of the Hitler-inspired German-American Bund. He is Fritz Kuhn, former German machine gunner, now a naturalized American citizen, who claims to have enrolled 200,000 U.S. Germans under the swastika. At his meetings, Führer Kuhn preaches orthodox fascist doctrine.
Diesen Lügen und Verleumdungen, die die Presse tagtäglich in den Tageszeitungen bringt, Widerstand leisten kann.
Across the United States, Führer Kuhn has established 25 summer camps and drill grounds. where those German Americans who believe in Nazi teachings can imitate Hitler's mighty military machine. At New York meetings designed to promote friendship and end the U.S. boycotts on German goods, uniformed Nazis parade.
Sieg Heil! Sieg Heil!
Their mere appearance doubles the picket line. When Führer Kuhn, with plans drawn for a New England Nazi encampment, purchases a site in Connecticut, he meets unexpected opposition in a community long proud of its tolerance.
We have no quarrel with what we term the older order of German people. But we do object, and we do protest against the insidious, treacherous activities of Nazi agents masquerading as American citizens.
Mr. Chairman, 2 of my great-great-grandfathers and 4 of my great-grandfathers fought for liberty. So did the other people of this town. I call upon all of you here to keep the Nazis out.
But the most...
There are a lot of exhibitor reports from that time that said that audiences applauded in tune with the audience in the film for the woman. So it really was, I think, together.
Chris, can I just, let me go, Tom, I think one of the most effective visual iconographic emblems of what and why we are in the war, which this really captures, encapsulates, and it comes out of Franklin Roosevelt's For Freedom speech. And what the good citizens of Southbury, Connecticut was saying there is that this is not relevant to what America is about, and that was caramelized into Roosevelt's State of the Union speech. And I'd like to mention that it was Arthur Schick who actually did a series. They were poster stamps called the Four Freedoms: freedom of speech, freedom of fear, freedom of religion, freedom of want. And it was, we all know the Norman Rockwell images that are up at the museum in Stockbridge, but those themes were, I think, what corralled and galvanized the American public, that racial, religious intolerance was why, as Frank Capra in his films, why we fight.
All right, so we got some great questions here, and I think the first one is really for Samantha and Philip, both. I think so. One of the questions was, we heard that the hallmarks of fascism are propaganda, violence, and the scapegoating of an enemy. And comic books, and you could say Arthur Schick's work as well, use some of those same elements, you know, or at least a kind of a clear kind of mission-oriented propaganda, violence, scapegoating an enemy. And so what does that, the question is, what does that paradox imply about how we motivate publics in a time of crisis?
Well, I think that how we motivate how the public in times of crisis is different than all of this that we're seeing, because we have social media now. We have such different ways to communicate, and in fact, what I find interesting is how older artists currently use social media who used to use different kinds of media. For example, I've been watching Yoko Ono recently using social media, whereas she used so many other different kinds of media in her past. But I don't know what this current moment's going to look like at all, and I'm scared. The little bit of propaganda that I've seen it, in ways that are so offensive to me, but would not be offensive to somebody else, and it's ubiquitous, and it's out of control. It's the snowballing. Whereas this there was a measuredness because of how it could be, laid out, how it could be transmitted. I don't know what's happening next, but you usually know.
Oh, well, let's go to the core of the question about the question assumes that the word propaganda propaganda in and of itself is something negative and pejorative. Propaganda is at the very root of all visual communication of Western art. If some of you remember sitting in with a Kodak slide projector, remember that? And you looked at the battle standard of Ur, when you looked at the Assyrian palace reliefs, when you looked at the Trajan's column in Rome, when you looked at the Arch of Titus, when you look at the effectiveness, the word propaganda, which was founded by the Holy See in 1622 in Rome, the office of the Propaganda Fide, for the propagation of the faith, the Catholic Reformation. So Arthur Szyk says eloquently and succinctly, all art is propaganda. So let's not think of him being a propagandist in any way, in a negative light. He was using the visual art to arouse the sympathy for the good fight and for the good cause.
Thank you. And this one, I believe, is for Tom. The question is, can you speak to film after 1945, right? And to elaborate on that, how does the fight against fascism in film kind of shift after we're not in a wartime context anymore? And the questioner has raised as prompts to immediate post-war films of Gentleman's Agreement and It's a Wonderful Life.
A great question. What happens is really interesting. From 41 to 45, of course, the film mentioned Frank Capra's Why We Fight, and there are a whole slew of documentaries and Hollywood feature films which promulgate American values in a very, I think, emotional, didactic way. Perfect Hollywood ability to communicate that tolerance and teamwork is important. Reaching back to our deepest roots to reestablish, what freedom and patriotism is. But of course, we're beaming these messages out when our army is segregated and when there's still a lot of anti-Semitism at home. But we don't want to talk about that during the Second World War, and I think it's really understandable that you want to emphasize unity and not disunity, not the problems we have at home. After 1945, it's like all those wonderful messages we beamed out come bouncing back. And now we can actually start talking about them. And there are, that great wave of Hollywood social problem films that start coming out in 1945. Maybe the first Jewish-related landmark is when Frank Sinatra, in a wonderful short called The House I Live In, which some of you probably know, gives a musical lesson in tolerance to a group of street kids who have just beaten up a kid because he's Jewish. And then there are the two films that I think you just mentioned one of them, which was Gentleman's Agreement. And the one that comes out before is a film called Crossfire. And I think between them, these films address the issue of anti-Semitism explicitly, which we hadn't done before. By then, America's ready to hear that message, and Hollywood gives you these messages usually in two ways. One is the way I hate, which is somebody looks into the camera and gives us all a lecture because he really knows what Americanism and tolerance is, and he's got to lecture us because we're stupid. And then there's the better way to do it. So in Crossfire, there's actually a lecture about, you shouldn't kill Jews. But the more ecumenical way to do it is there's a scene in which Robert Ryan, who is the vile anti-Semite, is standing next to Robert Mitchum, who is the embodiment of post-war masculine cool, right? And Ryan touches him on the uniform, on the shoulder familiarly, and Mitchum looks at his shoulder like, oh, now I'm going to have to get my uniform dry cleaned. And I don't care about Jews one way or the other, the average moviegoer might be thinking, but if anti-Semitism repulses Robert Mitchum, I do not want to be an anti-Semite. So all these films that come out, and of course there's another wave in 49-50, which touches on the real touchy issue, which is Jim Crow. So all of this stuff comes out of the Second World War, direct result of all that wonderful propagandizing people like Frank Capra did, and now we can start addressing, some of these films look a little corny or compromised in retrospect, but they were very important at the time.
Thank you. So another question that's kind of expanding on this a little bit too is about, the question is specifically on Hollywood today, but right, if you want to expand it out to all of y'all, what is some equivalent of kind of can you think of some Jewish American cultural work that's more contemporary, right? That's doing some of this similar kind of anti-fascist cultural work, or at least that's trying to revive the idea of a clear and present danger on the far right, either at home or abroad. Some kind of more contemporary examples that kind of do some similar cultural work.
Well, the genre that I work with, comic books, has evolved in many ways. So the graphic novel is everybody loves graphic novels now. It's the marriage of text and image. It's a really exciting medium. And so within that medium, we have different kinds of conversations because these books are longer and they do take on more serious subjects. They're not necessarily technicolor. They use different techniques. We can have splash pages and different panels. They can be black and white. And not taking on fascism so much, and of course you can't talk about comics, I don't think, without mentioning Art Spiegelman. He shows the effects of what fascism did. So if any of you haven't read Mouse, it came out in the 90s in 92, 96. He won the Pulitzer Prize for it. It's a really important book about his father, Vladek's journey as a survivor, everything that happened to him based on interviews. And I think it's really valuable. There are a lot of graphic novels that function that way. So Joe Kubert's Yussel is another example. He was a comic book artist originally during the Silver Age. I know we're running out of time, but there's a great arsenal of books and graphic novels out there for you to read about fascism and the effects of it.
Just want to jump in that I had a recent conversation with Art Spiegelman, and we were talking about the production of Mouse, and he said, it was from Schick's drawings and cartoons that I learned the details of the Nazi regalia. That he used it as almost his source book.
Maybe just quickly, one motion picture or HBO drama, right? Nobody goes to movies anymore. That I might recommend and might put some of all this together with the Lindbergh is the David Simon HBO series based on Philip Roth's The Plot Against America, right? Which I think clearly was made not about the 1940s, but about the present time period that we're in. It really tanked in the ratings. I think people maybe weren't ready for it, but it might be worth a second look. I think you guys know the Plot Against America. It has a conceit that's really terrifying because it's so plausible. Most of these kind of counterfactual novelistic conceits, like one of the Confederacy, one the Civil War, or whatever, you kind of have to leap through several hoops of imagination. But the conceit here is that what if Lindbergh had run for president in 1940 on an isolationist platform and won? And that's actually not an implausible conceit in 1940, given the stature of Lindbergh. I think today the bloom has gone off the Lindbergh legend, but certainly in 1940 would remember that gallant kid who flew across the Atlantic in 1927. And as your statistics mentioned, Americans did not want any part of another European war.
I think the reason the Plot Against America as a film series was not really a success is there was an exhibit in 1996 at the Jewish Museum. Norman Kleeblatt curated it, and the title of it was, I think, very pertinent. The title of the exhibit was Too Jewish. And within the Jewish community, there is an understanding, an almost telepathic understanding of the undercurrent of these themes. For the rest of America, red state, blue state America, it might be a little too allegorical or metaphorical.
All right, well, with that, we're at time. So thank you for everyone for spending your Sunday afternoon here, and also thank you for Gabrielle Rosenfeld.
Thank you. Thank you for getting